the interim dean of the Marxe School of Public and International Affairs. It is really my pleasure to welcome you here with us this afternoon for this hour. We're excited that this event brings together the Marxe School with the Department of Political Science, the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences. It's a collaboration that's long overdue, not long overdue, but one that we're very pleased to see grow. And we're grateful to Professor Saakian, I hope I said that correctly, who generously has used his class time as a place for us to hold this meeting. And last, I want to thank our communications department team at the Marxe School, who have really worked to put this together on very short notice and ensure that the meeting will run smoothly. They've just done an amazing job. So with that, let's get to the real substance of the event, which I know, about the war in Ukraine, the unfolding situation, which I know all of us are following assiduously, clicking refresh constantly. So with this, I want to turn it over to Carla Robbins, who's a distinguished lecturer at the Marxe School and the director of our Master of Public and International Affairs. Carla.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dean Aries, and thank you everybody for joining us here today. I hope this is going to be the first, as Dean Aries said, of many Marxe-Weissman and Weissman-Marxe conversations. We're very lucky to have with us here today Carol Giacomo and Jennifer Trahan. We're putting their full bios in the chat. But just a very quick review. Carol Giacomo is the chief editor of Arms Control Today, and she was the lead writer on national security and foreign policy issues for the New York Times editorial board from 2007 and 2020. And she covered diplomatic affairs for Reuters out of DC for 2 decades before that. And in full disclosure, we worked together at the Times and we shared a lot of time on the Secretary of State's plane at the end of the Cold War. So we're dating ourselves here. Jennifer Trahan is a clinical professor at the NYU Center for Global Affairs and director of their concentration in international law and human rights. And she serves, among her many contributions to international law, as one of the US representatives to the Use of Force Committee on the International Law Association, convener at the Global Institute for the Prevention of Aggression. And she's also served as an amicus curiae, I hope I pronounced that correct, friend of the court to the International Criminal Court on the appeal of the situation regarding Afghanistan, and on the Council Advisors on the application of the Rome Statute to cyber warfare, which I hope I don't jinx this, but potentially is the next front in this conflict. And my co-host, colleague, and very, very dear friend, Dr. Stephanie Golob, who is chair and associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Weissman, founding director of the Initiative for the Study of Latin America, and one of the godmothers of the MIA program here at the Marxe School. So this is a collaboration that's been going on for a long time. So just a quick note on format, and we're going to jump in. We've just an hour and a lot to cover. The 4 of us are going to have a discussion for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to our friends and colleagues in this webinar. We've already received some important questions with your RSVPs, and we've incorporated some of them into our opening questions. If you do have questions that come up in these early 30 minutes, please direct them in the chat to Mark's Q&A, and we'll get to as many of them as we can throughout the meeting. So Carol, I'm going to start with you because we journalists tend to be scene setters. I know you've written about a lot of conflicts over the years, but this one for me feels qualitatively different, not least because of how much we can see with our own eyes, including from open sourced intel, citizen journalists, and Zelensky and company's brilliant use of social media. I'm a pretty sophisticated consumer of news, but I feel like I'm drowning in information, except of course on what's happening inside of Russia. Can you start us out by telling us how you're consuming information and what you think are the most important areas we should be focusing on? I would say, usually I'd say in the next few weeks, but right now I'm going to say in the next few hours and days to give us a sense of how this conflict is developing.
In terms of sort of the logistics of where I go for information, I mean, it's just like all of you. There are trusted people that I follow on Twitter, and I don't rely on any one source. I scroll pretty quickly and pay attention to the people who I believe are most authentic, journalists who are on the job, on the ground, news organizations that have a credible record of coverage of world affairs, various experts who do keep close eye on open source information. There are organizations now who have collaborations with groups that do satellite imaging, and then these experts analyze that kind of data, and so it does give you information that is beyond, say, what you get from the Pentagon briefing or the White House or something like that. In terms of what measures I look at for change, identifying big changes on the battlefield, I mean, is Putin putting in any more troops beyond the, at roughly 200,000 that he deployed, has deployed at the moment? So far, the American government says they don't see those numbers being increased. Is there any movement of Russian tactical nukes into Belarus, for instance? Do we see any interesting political moves? Are governments talking to Putin? We've had Macron have conversations. We've had, I guess the Israelis have tried to play a role. My understanding is that there are some unofficial contacts between Americans and at least one Russian official. I don't know where that's going to lead. I don't know if it's anything. In the middle of battle like that, it's hard to really judge. I think watching the Chinese is an important, could be an important indicator. They've cozied up to, or Russia's cozied up to China in the last couple of years, and they could play a very big role in perhaps at least getting information to Putin, who seems to be rather isolated. And finally, I mean, I'm looking to see if there are any defections among, say, military, commanders or high-level political officials. I mean, that could be an indicator of internal trouble. So I'm keeping an eye on all that.
It's a lot to watch. I just one very, very quick follow-up on that. Putin made these threats. He called for, in a very sort of odd thing about putting his nuclear forces on alert. Have we seen any movement of nuclear weapons? Has anything changed in the posture of their nuclear weapons?
No, Bill Burns, the CIA director, and April Haynes, the DNI, testified on the Hill yesterday, and they said they're watching it very closely, obviously, and they have not seen any change in the posture. It could be, look, Putin is in a really bad place. He seems to have completely miscalculated how this would happen. He expected a quick victory. It hasn't happened. Will he escalate to tactical nukes, or at least the movement of tactical nukes? We don't know, but so far it doesn't seem to have happened.
Stephanie, over to you.
Thanks so much, Carla. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. So I've got an opening question for Jennifer. Putin not only rejects the rules-based order, he seems determined to break the system. So I was wondering if you could give us some insight into whether there's any hope of legal accountability here for Putin, and where would that legal accountability come from?
Great. Well, thanks for that, Stephanie, and thanks for inviting me to join. Yeah, we're all seeing horrific images that appear very indicative of war crimes. Simply the invasion is clearly the crime of aggression. So the question is, how can we have accountability? So the Ukraine is not, there's just a very technical difference. It's not a party to the International Criminal Court, but it's issued a 12-3 declaration accepting the jurisdiction, which is a long way of saying there is jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court over war crimes and crimes against humanity in the territory of Ukraine. For anyone who doesn't know, the International Criminal Court is a very multilateral tribunal that sits in The Hague, Netherlands. It was created by its states that are parties to it. The US is not a party, Russia is not a party. But when Ukraine accepts jurisdiction, crimes in Ukraine are subject to the court. And the prosecutor has opened an investigation. I think that's really important to kind of say, you know, the ICC's on this, we're watching. It comes after 39 states referred the situation to the International Criminal Court, which is really unprecedented. We've seen one state making a referral. We've seen 5 states refer Venezuela. We've never seen 39 states. So there's really a lot of multilateral engagement. There's got to have to be accountability. And the International Criminal Court isn't the only one out there. I mean, the Human Rights Council created a commission of inquiry that would be looking at human rights abuses. Civil society is at work documenting abuses. At the accountability level and in terms of state responsibility, we have Ukraine suing Russia at the International Court of Justice, also in The Hague, but a different institution in The Hague over the false claims of genocide. So I could, if time allows, I could talk a little more about why there is a crime of aggression jurisdiction and how that can be prosecuted. But I think your question, you asked, will Putin see justice? Well, first of all, I won't say, we should never say never, because I think Ratko Mladic, Radovan Karadzic, Slobodan Milosevic, Charles Taylor never thought they would see the inside of the courtroom. So, you know, it's always quite possible to have accountability. And a lot of the war crimes we are seeing are potentially being committed also by, you know, individuals lower down on the chain of command, mid-level commanders, et cetera. They are also all on the hook. Probably a little easier to get jurisdiction over them. Now, if the International Criminal Court comes to issue warrants, it's 139 states that are parties to the court would have an obligation to execute those warrants. So if there are outstanding warrants, it is at minimum a travel restriction on anyone who might have a warrant. If they're secret warrants, you know, individuals might not, sealed warrants might even not know there's a warrant out against them. There is also domestic war crimes legislation and crime of aggression legislation in many countries. Some have universal jurisdiction. It doesn't matter where the crime has occurred. So there may be a role for that. So there are a lot of potential venues for accountability. Just to say, I mean, some of the war crimes I think we're seeing, I know this morning there was news of a maternity hospital being hit. You know, we've seen Russian airstrikes against densely populated areas, rockets, cruise missiles destroying residential buildings, reports of cluster munitions hitting a nursery school and kindergarten. It looks like civilians being targeted when they're fleeing. Hospitals, at last count, I saw 16 hospitals being hit, what appears to be attempts at siege warfare. So overall, you know, these seem to be violating the prohibition against targeting civilians and civilian objects. Those are both war crimes. And they may be excessive force, so impermissible collateral damage in relation to the military objective. Of course, all of this will have to be investigated. Every time a civilian object is hit doesn't mean you have a war crime, because the war crime is intentionally targeting civilians or civilian objects. But sometimes when you have a cluster munition used in like a civilian area, it's just an impermissible weapon in a civilian context. And that's quite clearly would be the basis of war crimes charges. So I think the court will have a lot to investigate and prosecute. Unfortunately, when this is all over, and national jurisdictions may have some role. And if time allows, I can later maybe discuss the crime of aggression if of interest. Thanks.
Jennifer, thank you. Thank you for that. There's a lot there, and it is true that, you know, the Milosevic is never expected to be there. So never say never, but it will be a challenge. Carol, someone wrote in asking what's a no-fly zone. I'm gonna show off here and do it really quickly. it's basically using US or NATO air power to shoot down any Russian planes over Ukrainian territory. And the problem is that to do that, to fly their patrol planes, NATO would have to first take out air defenses, which would be in Russian territory itself, and to be ready, as I said, to shoot down any Russian plane that violates the zone. We are trying very hard not to get into a kinetic war directly with the Russians. Managed to do that, except came very close during the Cuban Missile Crisis. That said, 27 foreign policy experts, including people who really know Russia, like the former US ambassador to Moscow and NATO, Sandy Vershbow, Evelyn Farkas, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Russia, and former Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, General Breedlove, have just signed a letter calling for a very limited no-fly zone protecting humanitarian corridors in Ukraine. They're willing to take the risk. Putin, meanwhile, says Russia would view any nation declaring a no-fly zone as participants in the military conflict. And the administration is resisting this. They're also resisting the suggestion that the Poles have just made that they give us, MiGs, and we could give them directly to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are asking for either of these things. So what's the line here, Carol? How much do we allow Putin to veto actions that might really make a difference for the Ukrainians on the one hand? On the other hand, how do we know a line or try to toe a line enough to stop this thing from escalating?
I mean, the answer is, it's very difficult to know for sure what any of these actions will mean. It is very, look, what's going on in Ukraine is horrific. It is very difficult as human beings who care about other people to watch people be forced from their homes, their cities destroyed, people being killed. I mean, it is so utterly painful. This happens every time there is a conflict. Let's talk, I mean, we had years of war in Syria when the toll kept going up and up and up and up. And I mean, Russia got involved, Iran got involved, but the Americans stayed out of a major role in Syria. And it was but the decision was made that, an American role would only make things worse, and it would ultimately require the United States to be there long term, and there wasn't the political support for that kind of thing. Now, okay, so fast forward to Ukraine, I think this country is much more seized with this conflict. Certainly NATO is, certainly Europe is much more seized with this because it's so much more immediate, and it has to do with Russia, which is nuclear armed. But I think it requires the kind of care and clear-headedness that the Biden administration is showing. You don't want to give Putin a chance to change the narrative and be able to say to his own people, where there seems to be a considerable amount of opposition to Russia's role and what Russia has done. You don't want to give Putin the excuse of, NATO has attacked us, and suddenly, it boosts Putin's role and his credibility to continue waging this horrible war. I just think that I respect those people, Sandy Vershbow, Evelyn Breedlove. I just think at this moment, the caution is much wiser, particularly when, maybe there'll come a time when people will say, we've got to protect those humanitarian corridors in a way they're not doing now. Maybe they will decide eventually that there is some circumstance under which they can make those MiGs available. I mean, the question of the MiGs, which seems to be the question of the moment, the Pentagon is saying that the Ukrainians aren't necessarily making full use of the planes they have already, and that, these MiGs are really no match for the Russian air power, and that other weapons like javelins, like Stingers, can be very, very effective and more easily used by Ukrainian forces. It's not an easy call.
It's certainly not an easy call from a morality point of view. But there's also this line issue here, which is one, and the line is a really hard thing to do. I mean, the javelins, for example, are coming overland through Poland.
Right.
And so, and obviously, Biden has said we're not going to put troops in Ukraine, but if they were to attack Poland, because Poland's a NATO member, I mean, there's a lot of things that we're doing that are blurring the line in a pretty blurry sort of way. Is it clear to you where this line is?
No, I think it's
Not for me either.
Well, it's not clear to me.
I mean, people will make the argument that something like a javelin could be a defensive weapon, but at some point, all weapons have offensive, roles to play. So I think it's very fuzzy, frankly, and it's a question of how much can they do without provoking Putin to go even, more extreme than he has already.
Stephanie.
Right. Yeah, I think this is, thinking about multilateralism and thinking about NATO. I mean, that's one venue the United States has brought its allies together. Yeah. And I was hoping that Jennifer could come in and talk a little bit about the UN, because long before this war in Ukraine, the Security Council was paralyzed by Russia and Syria, by the veto, and China has consistently opposed any resolutions that might constrain its future behavior against Taiwan or Tibet. And now the Security Council appears paralyzed again with Russia's veto of a Security Council resolution condemning the invasion of Ukraine. That was 2 weeks ago on February 25th. But we also hear that the US and France and others are calling for possible Security Council meetings. So obviously it seems that there might be a role to be played by the United Nations, which there are many of us who are somewhat skeptical about what kind of role the UN can play. So I'd like to know whether you could give us some insight into how the United Nations could play a role in this conflict.
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, you're exactly right when you say the Security Council is paralyzed, and it's due to Russia's veto power. So we, reached the height of hypocrisy with Russia vetoing its own condemnation for basically the crime of aggression, which really makes you think, is this really how the veto was meant to be used? I have a book out called Existing Legal Limits to Security Council Veto Power in the Face of Atrocity Crimes. And it basically argues when there's genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity occurring, and the council is trying to stop the crimes, when you veto something trying to stop genocide, you're actually enabling the genocide. And is that a permissible use of the veto power? And of course, I argue it isn't, and it violates international law and violates the UN Charter. I recently expanded my arguments in a blog also to the crime of aggression, and really questioning I feel like the veto is used as it's above all law, and we have to not accept that. And the General Assembly could ask some of these legal questions to the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion. But more directly, to answer your question, what can the UN do? So I agree, the Security Council is paralyzed, so I don't really expect much out of the Security Council. So then we go to the General Assembly. And, we did see a very strong resolution out of them last week, 141 in favor, only 5 against, really, really strongly condemning the aggression by and UN Charter violations by the Russian Federation. And just to say, when you have Charter violations and then you have individuals who initiated the act of aggression, you actually have the crime of aggression. Prosecuting it becomes more difficult. But given Security Council paralysis, I think we'll explore more what can the General Assembly do beyond its condemnation. The GA, of course, can recommend sanctions. I mean, there are a lot of sanctions that, I don't know if that is needed. We have a lot of sanctions already in place without the GA having been involved. I mean, one idea I've been suggesting is the General Assembly could recommend a crime of aggression tribunal that would be negotiated between the government of Ukraine and the United Nations using, and we've had two of the tribunals kind of created that way, the Cambodia Tribunal and Sierra Leone Special Court. Cambodia and the UN negotiated the first, and Sierra Leone and the UN negotiated the second. So we have precedent for this. And because the crime basically cannot be prosecuted at the International Criminal Court, the great irony is that that is because the US narrowed the court's jurisdiction over the crime of aggression in 2010 in Kampala, Uganda at the review conference negotiations. And the US got inserted this as part of the amendment that the nationals of a non-state party can't be prosecuted for crime of aggression. So to explain in maybe more simple terminology, the nationals of a state that's not a party, so Russia, it would exclude the US, but it also excluded Russia. So now the International Criminal Court can't prosecute the crime of aggression. So one of the things they're thinking about at the UN is, could there be an aggression-specific tribunal created using the UN? There have also been proposals, and I've seen this coming out of individuals, prominent individuals in the UK, calling for a Nuremberg-style prosecution, countries pooling their domestic jurisdictions. And I have a blog out critiquing that approach, suggesting that's more selective justice, in that, next time we'll have Russia and Belarus, pull their jurisdictions and create a tribunal. So that's really kind of going back to the Nuremberg model of 1945, and the field has come a long way since then. So therefore, I endorse a much more multilateral approach of the General Assembly being involved in the creation of such a tribunal. A third point of view, Kevin John Heller was blogging that all of these are selective justice because we haven't in the past prosecuted US aggression. So we shouldn't just create a tribunal when Russian aggression is involved. And I somewhat agree that all countries should join the amended Rome Statute and subject themselves to crime of aggression jurisdiction. I don't see that happening in the short term. So I will fall back on anecdote that Brenda Hollis, she's a Cambodia Tribunal prosecutor, told me. We were debating selective justice, and she said, if 5 individuals committed a bank robbery and you could only catch 2 of them and try them, would you try those 2, even if 3 got away? And she's like, yeah, you would try those 2. So that was her answer to selective justice. So Russia's very, very clearly violated the UN Charter and committed the crime of aggression. We could go back and have discussions about the US. The US at least often has a plausible legal theory. There are a lot of Russian legal theories out there, and I don't think any of them are at all plausible. So if there ever was kind of a slam dunk crime of aggression case, I think this is it. So there's a long answer to your question, Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. So we're at 1:31, and I want to go to some of the questions that have come in. And I will tell you that the number one question, I sound like I'm on, Teen Choice Awards here, but the number one question that has come in is there an off-ramp here that is currently available for Putin? And how does this end? And Carol, because you're my dear friend, I'm gonna saddle you with that one.
Well, it's an important question. It's ultimately going to be the question. At the moment, I see no answer. More to the point, at this hearing yesterday with the CIA director, he made it very clear that he thinks that Putin is desperate and he is going to double down, and that that Putin doesn't see a political end, has no plan for how this will end, short of, ultimate victory, which I don't believe. And more importantly, the Ukrainians certainly don't believe that Putin will achieve. They seem to be quite determined to fight to the very end to protect their country. And if in fact Putin's forces do claim Kyiv, which is at this moment seems to be the primary goal, there'll be an insurgency that will be very difficult for Russia to resist, particularly if the Russians don't put more troops into the country. It's very hard to occupy a country with, as what's it, 40, 45 million people. So nevertheless, you know, at some point there's going to have to be a way to, I mean, at the moment, it looks as if there's going to have to be complete surrender by Putin. But, you know, he's a very proud man, very arrogant, ruthless kind of guy. And I find that very difficult to see happen. I mean, I think it's important even now for the West to try to keep some lines of communication open with the people around Putin, even if he's not listening to them, in case there could be an opening, some sort of diplomatic opening. I think that if the Chinese could be persuaded to step in and try to pull Putin off the edge, I think that could be, I mean, I think they could be a player in this regard, given that there's such an important country, and you know, the indications are that they are shocked at how far Putin has gone in this regard. You know, I hope someday he ends up at The Hague for sure, but you know, maybe there will have to be some sort of compromise that sends him off to, you know, an island in the South Pacific or something like that. But I wish I had a complete crystal ball on all of this, but I'm going to have to disappoint.
Jennifer has her hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to.
Professor Trahan, may I call on you?
Yeah, thank you, thank you. I'll put my hand down now. So I'm not a political scientist. I'm a lawyer, but I don't want to sound too naive, but I do have some hope if whether this could be settled through peace negotiations. Other than that, I just see a lot of brutality and a lot more killing on both sides. You know, if some kind of package, you know, if Russia withdraws everything from Ukraine, all forces, you know, lifting of all sanctions, massive recovery package for Ukraine. Ukraine agreed some agreement regarding neutrality, you know, Ukraine recognizing Russian annexation of Crimea, which, you know, it's kind of already lost Crimea. You know, I don't know what is resolved regarding Donetsk and Luhansk, but I think those are kind of the things that are on the table. And, you know, I don't know if this is possible. I also don't know whether, you know, you trust Putin at the negotiating table, because I thought they had just agreed to humanitarian corridors, and then you see individuals fleeing, being apparently fired on. So I don't have the epiphanies, but I would, you know, that is my one off ramp that would, you know, have a way out of just having this resolved through, you know, sheer firepower and brutality on both sides.
And I see a question in the chat that's asking whether China may be willing to assist in peace talks, or which countries may be possible mediators. But I just want to, you know, also consider that he is always thinking of history, right? So if he's thinking of historical analogies, probably what's coming to mind is Versailles. I mean, he doesn't want to walk into a situation in which he's humiliated. So I think this is the big issue is, how do you get Putin to the table, and what kind of a deal would Ukraine be willing to accept? Because Ukraine, you know, its existence has been threatened. So it's kind of the similar dilemma that we were seeing with where's the line in the question that Carla asked to Carol, right? This, you know, where is the line? Well, you know, what is the line that Putin would be willing to cross, and what would Ukraine be willing to accept? So, so I'm also, I think one of the things that questions that people have, another thing that people are interested in is the issue of you talked about the crime of aggression, Jennifer. But what about what's happening with cyber crime, with the cyber security issue, right? Because what's allowed and not allowed under international law, and what kind of what kind of action is being taken on that? Because it seems that that this has been part of this this conflict, whether outwardly or in secret.
Absolutely, yeah. So I was just on a launch of a book on cyber peace, and right before our panel, and it was basically on how can you deter cyber attacks, and I was writing on start by recognizing that cyber can play a role in committing genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression. And, I was using older examples. And of course, now we have these things playing out today. I think the way this played out, we had the cyber attack was really the first prelude to the act of aggression. So potentially part of the crime of aggression, and cyber potentially playing a role in some of the war crimes. This is a new field. I was privileged to be a part of the Council of Advisors on the application of the International Criminal Court statute to cyber warfare. And we just published a book saying, the court has to consider cyber attacks in terms of the crimes and developing expertise in this area and gathering information regarding this. And, I didn't really realize how kind of prescient this report would be, because I think this is really playing out now. I mean, there's a lot of disagreement at the UN over the regulation of cyber, and I think the majority of position is all of our international law should be applying to cyber, our basic use of force principles, our basic law of war principles, basic, all of our sovereignty, etc. All of the international law should apply in the cyber domain. And many experts accept that, as in the famous Tallinn 1.0 and 2.0 Tallinn manuals on cyber warfare. However, some states use cyber offensively and don't want international law regulating this. So this is still playing out at the UN level. I've only been involved in the part of the puzzle to say that cyber can be used as a means of committing atrocity crimes, and we need to start recognizing this, such as when Myanmar's military puts up, posts on Facebook that incite violence against the Rohingya. That is part of the genocide, and we need to start recognizing this in the crimes. And unfortunately, we do see cyber playing a role, and I think there were cyber attacks on the borders that has, delayed individuals being able to flee. There had been a massive cyber attack on the railway, which of course has been critical in getting people out of population centers. And luckily that was headed off and neutralized. So we are, unfortunately, I think it's a growth area, and we're going to see a lot more cyber attacks. There's also a lot of cyber crime and, malware on our computers and stuff. So I'm kind of talking more about the more catastrophic attacks. But unfortunately, this is a lot of militaries are kind of blending conventional capabilities and cyber in kind of what we call a blended attack. And I think we're going to see more of this in the future, and we're seeing it already now in Ukraine.
Can I just make a comment on that? My understanding is, people really thought that Putin was going to go in big with cyber, and that was understandable given what they've done already. But apparently he has not, and so I would say that is, one small positive, thing. That we have not seen a huge investment of Russian cyber warfare up till this point. I mean, he has that he can certainly escalate, but at least for the moment, it seems not to be a huge factor.
Yeah, and I'll just add why we think we haven't seen more is that the last time Russia used cyber attacks in Ukraine, they proliferated well beyond their targets. And this is quite frequently happens with cyber operations. So had there been much more cyber attacks, potentially could have proliferated into NATO countries and looked much more like also an armed attack on NATO countries. So this is some thought of why the cyber attacks haven't played such a major part, because of the fear of their proliferation.
That would suggest that Putin, and we're in one of these, like, we really don't know we really don't know what's going on. So I want to caveat with that. That would suggest more restraint on Putin's part
Mhm.
than I am going to give him credit for. And what we also know is that the US has a pretty aggressive forward defense effort going on, including cyber teams stationed in Eastern Europe that are battling in networks right now. So for all we know, A, God forbid tomorrow our ATMs will be shut down, and B, we really don't know what sort of battles are going on, how much arm wrestling is going on out there. I hope you're right, Jennifer. I hope you're right, Carol, but I don't know.
It may also just have been swift response to the cyber attacks that occurred. So I think they were shut down. So it may have actually been the West that prevented them from proliferating.
So Carol, I'm going to ask you a question that has come up, which is, we know so much about what's going on and the horror that's unfolding in Ukraine, and we increasingly know so little of what's happening inside of Russia. There are reports, as I said about, we're listening very closely to know whether things are going on around Putin, himself. And it wouldn't be surprising if we don't know a lot about what's going on inside the Kremlin, but remarkably, we don't know a lot about what's actually going on the ground in Russia because of this new media law, and because key news organizations like the BBC and Bloomberg and all aren't reporting from there. It's a pretty extraordinary thing. How do we get information to the Russian people about what's happening in Ukraine and about how the rest of the world feels about what Putin is doing?
It's a good question. First of all, the BBC decided to pull out, and then the last thing I saw was they had reconsidered that decision. But the New York Times, which I was shocked at, has decided to withdraw its news people precisely because of this law, which is so draconian. And of course, Putin has detained a major athlete, American athlete. And so if he's going to do that, he'd think nothing of detaining, the entire New York Times bureau, I would think. So we're losing those eyes and ears. But there is quite, and we know from Navalny and people, and we know because some incredible number of Russians have been arrested for protesting this war. So we know that there's a group of people out there who want to know what's going on and who are not happy with Putin. And we also, as the United States, the West, we have a track record of penetrating both the Soviet Union in the old days and other countries where the media is shut down. It's harder to get the message in, but there are Russians who are on the internet, and if they have VPN, there'll be some possibility. I'm hoping that, Americans and the embassy, Western governments have, look, I'm not a tech expert, okay? So I'm making some of this stuff up, but I know that there are ways to help people in closed societies be able to access the internet. Look at North Korea. Information gets into North Korea, even though it is the most closed society on earth. So, you can sneak in information on a thumb drive. You can, there are ways in order to get, it may not be as quickly, but you can still talk to people. And there's a lot of people in the West know a lot of people in Russia. And so the lines of communication will try to keep going however they can do that. And they're going to have to be, smarter about trying to make sure that the message gets across.
Do you see any sign that they're beginning to mount a communications campaign? Because I always sort of felt that we really, once the Cold War was over with, we didn't really need that sort of public information campaign.
Right.
That's CNN. Why did you need it? But now things are shutting down. Shouldn't the U.S. government be working? I'm not talking about propaganda. I'm just talking about.
I know, just regular information.
What's happening.
I don't know for sure. I am hoping that they are doing that. They seem to have thought through most components of this strategy that they're using now to push back against Putin. Maybe I'm giving them too much credit, but I think one possibility always had to be that Putin would try to, shut off the flow of information. He was already pretty tough on media, getting tougher on media in his country. So I don't know for sure. I'm just hoping that they're doing that.
Yeah, so
I'm sorry. There are a lot of independent actors out there too. People who hack and are able to, penetrate networks and get information across. So I don't know. It won't be as easy.
Yeah, that's anonymous, right? I mean, this is part of the hallmark of the age in which we live, is that we're not talking just about state actors, we're talking about non-state actors, and it's also true in the media space, right? In terms of the hacking space and all of that. So that also is very interesting to see that happening, and to what extent, on the one hand, the US doesn't want WikiLeaks to be spreading all of its diplomatic secrets all over. On the other hand, this is very useful to have a non-governmental group that, or this kind of group, wreaking that kind of havoc, or trying to make sure that information is out there. So, but it makes everything a little bit more uncertain. I'm also interested in the issue of the nuclear power plants and the like what do we know about what's happening in Chernobyl, right? I mean, it's kind of like that, oh my gosh, I'm having a flashback to 1986, right? That is this really, and I think that's also a really important piece of information, lots of information that we are not sure what's happening inside Ukraine, and also in terms of nuclear power plants. So that's I know I'd be interested to know if there are citizens that are sending that information out. We don't know what's happening inside Russia, but there's also a problem of media within Ukraine, like of getting information out of that information, because that's there's somebody in the audience that wanted to know how we prepare for nuclear annihilation, and it's we're really on this sort of edge of and part of it is because we really don't know about to what extent are these nuclear power plants at risk, who's defending them, can cyber actually affect them, and the like. So that's another aspect of it.
Chernobyl is the Russians have control of Chernobyl, but there's a local staff which is there to operate it. Today, though, there was the reporting that it had shut down. However, and Ukrainian officials had, there were tweets and other statements where they were expressing alarm about this. I've subsequently seen some reporting that they have backup generators, and people aren't quite as worried about that as it may have sounded in the beginning. I think there are 3 other sort of major power plants, nuclear power plants in Ukraine, and I think at least one of them has been, I don't know if it's in Russian control or it's been attacked by the Russians. So there's concern about that, in part because, if you damage the nuclear core, there could be some release of radiation, but also because they are power generators. And if you cut off power, puts the population at greater risk of dying of cold or living without electricity. So there are serious concerns about that.
Jennifer, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about not that I'm going to suggest that your life's work doesn't have value, but a little bit more about the contrast between international law and a brutal kinetic war can sometimes seem like, and the gap has got to be there, but there's something more going on here that really intrigues and depresses me all at once, which is I think that Putin has been on a long campaign far before Ukraine to break the international norms and the international legal system. I mean, this is a guy who sent like Dumb and Dumber into Salisbury, England to poison, Sergei Skripal with Novichok, with a chemical weapon. I mean, this is one of the greatest international norms. You don't kill people with chemical weapons. And then he poisoned Alexei Navalny on his own territory with chemical weapons in the most brazen of ways. I mean, he could have shoved both of these people in front of a truck and easily killed them, but he did it with a chemical weapon, in my theory, because he wanted to break a norm. He's been trying to break the system because if the system looks corrupt, it's his own authoritarianism, is one of the great readouts, one of the great protections. That's my theory. I'm sticking with it. So I also believe that, when this is over with, a lot of people are arguing that at least things like military alliances will be stronger. People are coming together and saying, yeah, we believe in NATO now. We believe more even in the EU, that a lot of these institutions that were looking creaky and old have a new life. Are we going to come out of this saying that international law has a new life, or that it looks really, really outdated by comparison with the disruptors like Putin? And I want you to step back, not as a person who believes in international law, but as someone who has a more critical view of it. And I mean intellectually critical, not negatively critical.
Carla, thank you for that. I very much join your critiques. So I teach basic international law. I'm going to do that this afternoon. And, I first have to start my students, what is international law and does it matter? And I do start with the hypothesis that there are certain times it works less well. We have a lot of laws of war. And I think during times of war, it's particularly flouted. And we have certain individuals who I don't think it deters. So we could have a whole discussion, your Pol Pots and, your Hitlers. Could they be deterred? Can your Putin be deterred? Does any of this matter? So I think, all countries are not the same. There are many countries that really take international law very, very seriously. And we have far greater challenges when there are authoritarian countries. Now, Russia's not the only one. I mean, China's crimes against the Uyghurs, which I thought we would get some attention with the Olympics, but now with the Russian invasion, we're not even talking about that. But those are just staggering crimes. And it's particularly in these situations that international law is challenged. We won't have a referral to the International Criminal Court regarding the Uyghurs or a tribunal created because China's got the veto power. So we could talk about the veto power. And, I think there may be all of this and Russia's veto of its own condemnation may trigger more critical scrutiny. I'm actually heartened by other countries coming together in so much multilateral support. 39 countries referring to the case to the International Criminal Court, 141 condemning Russian aggression in the General Assembly. So I think we may come out of this with a sense that we really need a strengthened commitment to international law. The law is there. It's kind of the enforcement. How do you get it enforced against some of the bad actors? And the norm we're talking about here against aggressive use of force is in Article 2.4 of the UN Charter that says your only exceptions are self-defense or where the Security Council authorizes force. And Russia isn't acting in self-defense. It didn't start the war in self-defense, and it's not authorized under Chapter 7. So there's no legitimate reason for this use of force. But how do you get it enforced? So I have worked for about 20 years on the crime of aggression, which originally was prosecuted in the Nuremberg Charter. And then it had been agreed in 1998, it would be part of the International Criminal Court statute, but they didn't get around to finishing the definition. So he actually did 10 years of negotiations and concluded the definition in 2010. And an initial agreement on conditions for the exercise of jurisdiction. It is only now in 2018 activated the International Criminal Court, but I think events today show the jurisdictional regime is not strong enough. So I think we really need to have to go back to the negotiating table on that and strengthen the regime, either through amending the Rome Statute, creating an aggression tribunal. It's really only then that we will have enforcement of the core norm of the UN Charter system. So I think all of these events, and I hope similarly, there's much more attention to the role of cyber in all of these crimes. So I would think we'll come out of this with renewed emphasis on international law, multilateral commitment to it. How do we get it enforced, particularly against our strong, these strong actor countries that are authoritarian and really outliers? Those are the tough nuts to crack, particularly if they hold a veto power on the Security Council. But I think we'll come out of this with just much more sense we need to strengthen international law.
Thank you for that. We have 2 minutes left, and there have been so many additional good questions, people asking about what this means for the future of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, people asking what this means for the Iran deal, people asking, very legitimate questions about, did we ignore the genuine concerns of people in Donetsk and Luhansk for too long? People asking the very legitimate question about whether we made a mistake of expanding NATO. In other words, I'm just looking at all the questions that we didn't have time to get to. Are any of Russia's demands for ending the war acceptable to prevent escalation? These are really important questions that we didn't get to. One of my students who is obsessed, rightly, with the Budapest Memorandum, in which we committed to protecting Ukraine when they gave up their nuclear weapons. Yay for caring about that. And the question, but if Putin already invaded Ukraine on his own accord, why are we talking about what we can do to avoid provoking him? A very good question. And of course, Poland's offered about fighter jets. Is it really off the table? And what more can we do to be helping the Ukrainian people? Which are all incredibly important questions, which shows how incredibly informed the Baruch community is. Stephanie, I'm going to let you finish off by thanking everybody and promising that getting them to promise to come back to continue this conversation.
Absolutely, really, it's my pleasure to be part of this conversation. I want to thank you, Carla, for being my partner in crime, and I also want to thank our distinguished guests, Carol Giacomo and Jennifer Trahan, for being with us this afternoon. I want to thank Professor David Sahakian and his Students in Political Science 2001, which is the host of this event. I want to thank everybody who made this possible technically, Diana Lazov in particular. I want to thank Dean Nancy Arias and also Dean Jessica Lang, who was here briefly, my dean from the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences. This is a great partnership, and we will continue this. We have a Global Insights event next week, in which I'm also sharing the podium with Professor Desmond Arias, looking at transitional justice in Latin America today with two distinguished speakers. I'm very excited about the possibility of speaking more about this issue. I think it's one that students at Baruch care very deeply about. Many people very personally affected by what's happening in Ukraine and in Russia. And so I want to end by saying that, focusing on the fact that we trying to understand and trying to hope and that we will see this conflict resolved. But in the meantime, stay alert, everyone. And thank you very much for being with us this afternoon.
Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Carol and Jennifer.
Thank you.